Cool. So let's go ahead with creating our first content record in this project. I think the easiest to start off with would be the person, since if I remember correctly, we just had three fields. We had the name, the title, and the company. That's excluding all of the sort of blocks that we had associated with this model. So I think we could split this into two videos, where first we just interact with the base model itself. In the next video, we'll take a look at enriching the content of a model with the content we add into the blocks associated with this person for, I think it was the contact info and the testimonial. So one of the first things to point out here is that I had made a grave error when creating this model, and that was not setting any of these fields as required. Maybe I was being lazy or I just wanted to highlight something, but essentially there are use cases where you would not need any fields as required, right? This could be if you're creating a bunch of entries in the CMS programmatically via the API for things like clicks or front-end interactions or some data that you want to bring in. But to us as content editors, there really isn't a case where we need blank entries. What I mean is, if I go ahead and try to save this person without giving a name, title, or a company, I can. And this is pretty useless to me as a content editor, because when I look at the people now, I just have this internal label of the record ID, which again, it's pretty useless to me as an editor. And if this was somehow published and shown on the front end, then I'd have a really hard time kind of figuring out what's going on the website. So let's go ahead and delete this. And the first thing we'll do is rectify this model. If we go back to the schema, let's go to the name and make this one a required field. What this does now is when I go to create a person, I'm not going to be able to save any of this info without adding a name. I'll get an error that this record couldn't be created. It doesn't matter how many times I rage click the save button, Dato's just not going to let me create a person without giving them a name. So let's get rid of these notifications, and maybe we'll start off with the obvious ones, right? I mean, Alessio and I are working on this project together, so I'll go ahead and create one for Alessio, who is working on marketing with me, and I'll go ahead and save this. And just to complete this, let's go ahead and add myself in as well. I am also marketing at DatoCMS. Now, when I save this record, it's essentially available to me as a draft piece of content. You'd notice that Dato tells you this is not published. That's because when we created the model, we had sort of set the draft published workflow stages for this. Now, there might be several use cases on whether you need or don't need these different stages, but essentially the most common application I've seen is websites having a staging or a preview URL usually have an API token that queries for draft content, which means if you're working on a new version of some content or just want to see what it would look like in a staging environment before it goes live, you would query for all of this draft content on your front end. And once you're happy with how things look and you're ready to deploy to your website, you'd go ahead and publish this, at which point the API token that's querying for published content on your production website that's shown to your users and your customers would consider this content as complete and start rendering this on the front end as well. Now, workflows in DatoCMS can be sort of configured depending on your plan and your use case. You could have things like draft, translation required, approval required, and so on before reaching a published state. So essentially, that's where you would handle the workflow of each content. And now if we go back to the content view, you can already see that it's not as blank and ugly as it was before. We're starting to see content, which is great. So in the next video, let's work together on enriching these people by creating more and sort of enriching them with the content that we could associate them with the blocks we'd created when we were modeling this model.